Hey friends, I want to let you know about a conference I'll be hosting in San Diego, California on faith, sexuality, and gender. That's October 19th through the 20th. The evening of October 19th will be an introduction to the LGBTQ conversation, and then all day on October 20th, we'll dive deep into questions related to ministry, policy. We'll dig deep into the trans conversation. We'll hear testimonies from people. So again, if you want to learn more and wrestle with questions surrounding faith, sexuality, and gender, check it out on our website, centerforfaith.com. And go to the conference link and you can register online. Again, that's October 19th to 20th. If you live in the San Diego area or if you want to drive really far, you can attend live in person. There's still room. If you can't make it out in person, you can also live stream the event. Again, all the information is at centerforfaith.com. Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. My guest today is Dr. Matthew Lee Anderson, who is an assistant research professor of ethics and theology at Baylor University. He received his doctorate from Oxford University in Christian ethics. He's the author of a couple books. His most recent book is Called Into Questions, Cultivating the Love of Learning Within the Life of Faith. We were going to get to that book, but we didn't because we got caught up in kind of a back and forth conversation around the relationship between sex and procreation and contraceptives, and also his his unorthodox views on adoption. So if you need a podcast to agree with you, then this one is not for you. If you don't mind being challenged with some questions that you might find disagreeable, if not offensive, then you can go ahead and keep listening. So please welcome to the show for the first time, Matthew Lee Anderson. Matt, is this the first time you've been on Theology in the Raw? I'm really embarrassed if it is.
It is. It is the first time. I'm a rookie.
I think that's your doing, though. I'm pretty sure I've asked you before. No?
You have never once asked me. No, this is not true. I think you might have mentioned it in person when I saw you. You might have been like, I should have you on sometime. And I said, I'm around. I'm not doing much.
I'm here.
You can call me. But, you're a hard date. You're a hard date to get. So
I do apologize.
I don't put myself out there.
Okay. Yeah. I feel like you may check your DMs or something. I'm almost positive. Or maybe it's what led to this conversation. So either way, you're here. That's what matters.
I'm right. Yeah. Just bank on this. In part because I've been harboring resentment against you for how long have you been doing this? Are you going on like 8 years?
2014. I started. It was a radio show. I think it became an official podcast. I think early 2015. Golly, okay. That's a long time.
Yeah, I think Mere Fidelity was going before you.
Yeah.
So, but we're not nearly as famous as you are because we don't do it as consistently and we're not as organized, and you're like a real podcaster and we're just sort of people who fake it podcasting.
Wait, you've been doing it since what, 2014? 2013?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're on year 9. I think it might have been, we're approaching year 10, I think.
You don't do it consistently? What do you do, like a couple times a month or just whenever?
Yeah, we get a couple times a month in. There's 4 of us and we're it's really tough organizing schedules for us. It's a nightmare. So yeah, we're just not as consistent. That's my excuse for why our audience isn't as large as yours, Preston.
I love your podcast is awesome. I love how honest you guys are.
Well, we need to have you back on.
I would love to come back on. It's been a while.
Yeah.
Now that I think of it. What did we talk? I think we talked about nonviolence last time I was on, right? That was
all your very wrong opinions about that. I think
that's right. I was so glad to have Andrew Wilson on my side on that because he was able to point out where you're wrong.
He's changed. He's I think he's at this point probably fully come around to my position, recognize my rightness, not only in that respect, but in many other respects.
I just talked to he was just on the podcast. He said, well, he did reference as in the past tense that we were on the same page. So maybe he's, I think you and I would probably be very similar if we got down to it. There's probably, I think when it comes to, and we don't need to talk about this. I didn't want to go this. I'm not prepared to talk about this, but,
I'm always prepared to talk about your wrong opinions, Preston.
We would both agree, I think, that the general tenor of the Christian faith should be one of nonviolence. So when people think of Christianity, they should immediately think, oh, that's the religion that loves their enemy. That's the whatever. Not, but if somebody breaks into the door, the axe murderer comes in as a last resort, I might use violence. Like, but Christianity has a reputation of being profoundly militaristic. And I think that is just cuts against the grain of the gospel. Do you agree with that or no? How can you disagree?
I agree with all that, except I'm honestly not sure about the reputation claim. I'd have to think through whether Christianity does have that sort of reputation and why it has that reputation and whether that reputation is warranted, because it seems to me entirely unwarranted.
I think, I guess it depends on who we're asking about Christianity. I think if you go outside the U.S., because when they think of Christianity, it's so intertwined with right-wing politics in America. Like I think a lot of people outside the U.S., when they think of Christianity, they think it's just so intertwined with like American politics. I mean, that's pretty. I mean, I'm going anecdotally, but I can think of like 10 different countries I've been to where that's definitely the case. You talk about Christianity, and immediately you start talking about politics. It seems like.
I love anecdata. It's my favorite form of argument.
I'm sure I could find data to back up my anecdote.
I'm sure you could.
But I don't want to talk about me. I don't want to talk about my views that you don't yet agree with. But let's okay. So I do at some point in this conversation want to talk about your book called Into Questions: Cultivating the Love of Learning Within the Life of Faith. How's that for advertisement? Just kind of.
That's great. I appreciate that.
Integrate the subtitle.
If we don't talk about it, then people just have to buy it and read it, which is better. That's the point of these things, right?
So I do want to get to it, but what I love about hearing you speak, Matt, is that you're incredibly honest, and sometimes I wonder, are you trying to get canceled, or are you trying like you're not? I mean, I don't think you provoke simply to provoke. There's some people that are just provocateurs that they just get off on just saying the part out loud that is going to rile people up. I don't see that motivation in you, and yet you do end up having that effect on some people. So I'm curious. Okay, here's my question. We didn't plan this from our audience. We actually offline. We're like, what direction you want to go? And we're like, I don't even know. Let's just start talking and see where it goes. What I'm curious, if you don't mind, what would be the top 3 or 5? We'll just start with number 1 things that you have said or believe that can or will or might get you canceled. What are some of your most unorthodox, maybe, or unpopular hot takes that you are really passionate about, but maybe many other people are not?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I get canceled for is going to depend on who I'm talking to, right?
Okay.
So one thing that I have experienced in this world is I have opinions that are unpopular in basically whatever room I go into, and I tend to bring to the surface the unpopular opinions for that particular room. So that's kind of as a caveat, not I hope, as you say, to be a provocateur, but because I was convinced pretty early on by a couple of claims, one of which is that there are lots of ways in which, say, secular progressives are going awry in this world. Like, there's lots of ways in which I think they're wrong on matters of sexuality, on abortion, on big hot button issues. I think, in general, if you're thinking about a secular progressive, there's lots of ways I think they're wrong. And that makes me unpopular in those sorts of rooms, though unpopular in ways that we'd all be familiar with. But I also became convinced that in order to speak honestly and courageously and with confidence about those issues, I needed to see the ways in which my own communities was also implicated in them, and understand how my own community has contributed to the rise of certain ideologies outside of the church, and to be honest about that in the rooms that I have been in with my own peers, because I have wanted to not just tell the truth, but to tell, in one respect, the whole truth
Mm.
about things. And I think if you do that, then you invariably put yourself in a situation where you're going to be unpopular with people on your own side. And some of this is like, we make decisions. You do this, right? Like, we make decisions about how we're going to make arguments in public and what sort of issues we're going to take up. And when I was just starting out, I remember thinking about my dad and being in the 8th grade and having someone tell me about my dad, so a third party, and talking to me about my dad, say, "Oh, I really like your dad. He just calls him as he sees him. Like, he just calls him as he sees him, and I really like that. I really respect that about your dad." And I remember thinking that as an 8th grader and thinking, "Oh,
Huh.
I've never heard anyone say that about my dad before. I don't know what my dad is like behind closed
Huh.
doors where he's going into meetings with people." Um, and the fact that my dad had that sort of reputation was, to me, really honorable.
Huh.
And the sort of thing that I thought, as I started writing, like, at the end of the day, like, when I die, I kind of would like to be known as someone who called him like I see
Mm.
him, regardless of who I think is implicated, regardless of who's
Mhm.
offended about that, not for the sake of offending people, but because I really love the truth and I really love my friends, and love my own side and want my own side to live into the fullness of the truth. And I want to live into the fullness of the truth. And so that's been my MO in terms of picking up issues and what I end up saying and what I don't end up saying. Or at least that's what I've tried to
Mhm.
do. You would do that more or
Yeah.
less consistently. And to claim that that's I've always had that sort of lofty, pure motivation would be giving myself far too much credit. Um,
Calling it like you see it, I agree that that can be noble if it's thought out. Because I know some people that have that kind of personality, but it's like they just have these opinions that are just not well thought out. They just like,
yeah,
and they have a personality type too. They just kind of like being offensive, and that's I'm not super impressed with that. But if somebody has a well thought out opinion about something, that and they don't censor, where they're like scared somebody's going to get upset if they say something that's true, then I think that's more respectable. Real quick though, you said, I mean, you've referred to kind of like your tribe, your circle, whatever. How would you describe that? What is your tribe, your circle that you might sometimes offend because you are, critical of it? And I
yeah.
want to get to
I'm
some
not sure
maybe
I
some
have
concrete
one
examples.
anymore. To be perfectly honest, like, I genuinely don't know that I have one anymore because I've taken stands that have alienated me from lots of rooms or communities, and I think that I now have a reputation as something of a firebrand who's unreliable. And so, for instance, communities or groups that I am highly sympathetic with, like the Gospel Coalition or groups like that, they don't call me very much to do things
That
at this
used to be
point.
more or less your general tribe ish. Would you say a gospel?
Yeah,
I
that's
think
right.
even that's broad enough. It's not necessarily Baptist. It's not necessarily. It's kind of Reformed ish, Baptist ish, but it's kind of
Yep.
an umbrella tribe, if you will. So that's what you came
Yeah,
out of,
that's right.
or were kicked out
But
of.
they haven't kicked me out. It's not clear that they view me as a reliable partner in the sort of work that they're doing.
Okay.
Um, which, that's fine. That's having to do with prudential and strategic decisions that I've made. Um, like the crew of folks at Mere Orthodoxy, which I founded, continue to be a sort of traveling company who
Hmm.
are willing to put up with my own idiosyncratic views. Where I'd mark it as like a deep kind of frustration with conservative evangelicalism for some of the ways in which we're entangled in the ideologies of the world that many conservative evangelicals are comfortable denouncing as long as they remain outside of evangelical circles.
Can you give an
And so deep
example? Can you give some concrete examples or one example, like what you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I like in my own sort of right. Yeah, I didn't give you any of my most controversial
We'll
opinions.
get there. We'll get there. Yeah.
But I mean, to give you one that makes me really popular, I really think in vitro fertilization and evangelicalism's complicity in certain forms of reproductive technologies and ways of um, preventing children is really problematic, right? To use a
Yes.
nice, safe, vague term. I think it's wrong, actually. And the reality is that to
Wait,
write
all
against,
birth control, certain forms of birth control, all forms of birth control, or
yeah, so I think at this point I'm opposed to contraception,
okay,
but we could pick more permanent forms of birth control.
okay,
Things like tubal ligations and vasectomies, the massive expansion of vasectomies within evangelical circles among men is just astonishing to me. Like, I
hmm,
write about these things, so I'm a weird sample set, but the number of people, and here's some anecdata, right? The number of people who have come up to me, number of guys who have come up to me and volunteered that they've had a vasectomy is just really bizarre.
hmm,
And these are people in evangelical context, in leadership at churches, et cetera. And I think, like, I look at the expansion of vasectomies entirely uncritical within evangelical circles. And I think, gosh, what are we doing here? I think we're taking a biological like system that's functioning and we're breaking it.
hmm,
And we're breaking it for the sake of attaining some kind of social end where a couple does not want to have another child. They could avoid a child in lots of other ways. They could be permanently abstinence from having sex, but they want that good, that very intensely pleasurable good, and they want to avoid the dangers of or costs of having a child as they see them. So they effectively mutilate their bodies. Now, if you frame it that way, it starts to sound a lot like what people are doing when it comes to gender affirming care and trans
huh,
surgeries, right? But the mainstream evangelical world is full of people who are willing to denounce all of that and to write books and give talks and make a lot of money about that. While in the meantime, the people who are paying for those talks and consuming all that
hmm.
content and being very excited about that particular cultural battle are engaging in a practice that is framed that way, not so different, right? Like, we're implicated in this sort of broader understanding of sex in the human body. But to say the one makes you, well, it means you don't get invited back.
Okay, so let me. What about out of say the mother? Say you've had a few kids, and the pregnancies have gotten increasingly more difficult on the mother. Maybe not life threatening, but extremely difficult. In that case, would you still see it as just as morally wrong for the guy to get a vasectomy, or would you say there's either or would you say like, yeah, you should stop having sex then because sex is for procreation, and if procreation another kid is going to possibly really harm the wife, then don't have sex, or other forms of contraceptive. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, those sorts of cases are really hard. And I recognize that there's a disproportionate burden on women when it comes to procreation, right? Like, we have to acknowledge the asymmetrical burden that women have vis-a-vis men. But I am fascinated by the difficulty with which evangelical couples have in imagining not having sex. Like, I
Hmm.
don't think that sex is only for procreation. I really don't. I think there's a
Yeah.
unitive good. I think there's, like, there's pleasure, right? Like, there are lots of reasons why it's good to have sexual activity. If God wanted sex to be only for the purpose of procreation, I don't think he would have built in a time when a male and a female could have sex without procreating, right? Like,
Mhm.
there's a time that is
Mhm.
built into our bodies, into the female body, when she's able to receive the man and not conceive a child. And so if you even look at it from that standpoint, you think, like, well, it's very clearly the case that sex cannot be only for the sake of
Right.
procreation. Um, but it's impossible for many evangelical couples to imagine not having sex again. And that inability to imagine that is to me intertwined with the deep inability to imagine what it's like to live as a single person. Right. So I'm interested in married couples cultivating the virtue of chastity within their unions. And that means, in part, a regular identification with those who are called to celibacy by abstaining from sexual activity. And sometimes that might even be a heroic calling where they're called, obligated to abstain from sexual activity for a long period of time for reasons of danger, et cetera. Like that can happen. And that can happen within a marriage. And that's okay. That's the burden that we're placing on single people. That's what we're calling single people to as a church. So why are we not also comfortable calling married people to that on a regular basis? I think if you ask that sort of question, you start thinking, well, maybe it's because we have a culture of marriage where sexual activity is regarded as essential, as necessary, as idolatrous as the broader society around us. We just haven't owned it within our own communities. And that allows us to have these very loud, very critical stances towards what's happening in the society around us without taking seriously the realities and the dynamics within our own communities. Like I said, I'm very popular. Yeah. People invite me to parties all the time.
The anti-sex guy. I mean, but in your own logic, so yeah, I guess I don't think you've answered the question. Like, since you said sex is designed in part for procreation, we might even say ultimately for procreation, but clearly it's not just for. There's other goods in the marital sex act. Then shouldn't there be space to engage in that sex act while preventing procreation? If procreation could end up harming the woman in particular?
There might be space for engaging in that sex act while avoiding procreation, but not necessarily preventing, right? There's two different moral choices there. There's a choice to abstain and there's a choice to stop or prevent. And I think that those are very different moral choices. The choice to prevent procreation while engaging in sex splits the will in two directions. On the one hand, you say, we're open to life, right? Like just to say what evangelicals will often say, we're open to life in this broader way. We're just making a choice to prevent life if it's conceived through this act, or if it might be conceived through this act. I think that essentially creates a dichotomy within the will. It ruptures the will. It means there's an attempt to both will X and not X at the same time. And that's a sign that you're engaged in some sort of moral rationalization, that you actually have a type of moral wrong that you're trying to excuse. And it just seems like a contradiction within our practical reasoning to affirm we're open to life and we're also just taking steps to prevent it, where like we don't want life to occur is what we're saying. And it's not only that we don't want life to occur, it's that we want to engage in this sexual act without it bringing about life, right? Versus saying, we don't want life to occur, which means we're not going to engage in the sexual act. So I think abstention is a different moral position than prevention. And I think that gets lost on a lot of people.
But I hear that. I guess what if someone said, I'm not open to, or I'm open to life. I have 4 kids, 5 kids, 6 kids. We have plenty of life. And my wife is now in her late 30s, early 40s, and she can still have a kid, but it might be really like extra hard on her body. Might not even be just healthy for her to have a kid. So no, I want to continue to engage in a sex act. We both want to, but we are not open. We want to cut off the possibility to the best that we can of life happening while still engaging in the sex act. Would you say that that's a morally wrong decision to make?
If one is making choices to prevent conception from happening, I think that is morally wrong. I think the issue with respect to those sorts of
cases, an unpopular view, man. I don't agree with that, but that's fine.
This isn't even my most unpopular view.
Let me make it clear. I actually lean, and my audience knows this. I've talked about it quite a bit. I lean a lot more over the last, I would say, 3 or 4 years, a lot more Catholic on the question. So I 100% agree that we have really just absorbed a secular perspective that has just completely separated sex from procreation.
Yeah.
In fact, I would even say if a couple wants to get married and does not want to have kids, biological kids, and there's no like health reasons, it's just kind of like, yeah, we just don't want kids. I would question. I won't, not gonna be as strong as you are. I think I would say, well, the theological burden of proof rests on you to convince me that you are called to marriage and not called to have kids, because I think those two go hand in hand. Marriage is
Mhm.
designed for the procreation of children, the rearing of children. Now, through the fall, through whatever, there's all kinds of things that might complicate that. Infertility is obvious one. Maybe there's certain health issues or whatever. But if they just willingly say, we do want to get married, we do not want to have kids, we are going to engage in sex, I would say I would again say that defend that theologically for me, rather than just
Yeah.
assume that that's obviously totally fine. So I'm with you on that, but I don't know. Because of procreation not being the only, I would even say it's the primary purpose of the sex act. I mean, it's etched into the whole biological function of sex. I mean, it's like God's screaming at
Yeah.
us. This is a procreative act. But yeah, I'm
No,
kind of
so I
let
think
you respond.
I understand all that. It seems to me that, and I don't actually don't I really don't think that those who have objected to contraception have done a good job at all of making the arguments for why. Like, I think
Mm,
it's mostly the arguments against contraception are very bad. It seems to
mm,
me that one central issue, and do we take time seriously within our sexual lives and honor the fact that within the structure of creation, it seems like there is a time to conceive and a time to not conceive. And
mhm.
that one can engage in sexual acts during a time in which conception is possible and have a chance of conceiving, and one can conceive in sexual or engage in sexual acts in a time when conception is almost certainly, but not necessarily certainly, not possible.
Yeah.
Um, and it seems to me that honoring the time of our bodily life
Mm,
is crucial to engaging in chastity as a virtue, right? So those are the ways in which I really want to think about it. How am I honoring the time that is built into our bodies? And if I don't want children, conforming my sexual life to the time that God has instilled into creation, much as we would with work and the Sabbath? And to what extent within that am I being put into a situation where my own desires are having to be formed in such a way that I possess my vessel in restraint and honor, to use Paul's language? Um, to what extent is my sexual life being conformed such that I have to identify with those who are celibate and see, taste in a very limited, partial way, the sort of self denial
mm,
that celibate or single people are called to every day for their whole lives, right? Like,
mm,
thinking about abstention from sex within marriage in those sorts of ways takes the anti-contraception position and turns it into a way of thinking about what marital chastity is. What are the goods that this allows for? How can saying no to sexual activity in a marriage create room for other forms of affectionate physical contact that are very, very important, not only as a precursor for sex, but in their own right, right? Like, if it is the case that you can't hex, well, that doesn't mean you don't have to touch each other, right? It means that you can engage in forms of touch that are intimate and appropriate, but not aimed at cultivating sexual desire to lead to orgasm. And many marriages that I have seen don't have those forms of touch within them, because once those forms of touch emerge within them, the thought on both sides is, where's this heading? Now that's a great thought, right? That's a lot of fun, but actually it's very good to cultivate other forms of intimacy within a marriage. It makes a marriage more thicker, more robust. And so I think that, like, we have to be able to imagine. What I really want to drive home is we have to be able to imagine. We are calling single people to a robust, thick, great life without sexual activity. We have to be able to imagine that good even within our marriages, because if we can't, we're like putting a demand or a burden or a cross on single people that they're going to be incapable of carrying, because the majority of people in the church are living in such a way that they are giving into their sexual desires whenever they have them.
Mm.
And they're contracepting and they're engaging in those practices in such a way to both permit and, you know, make possible their fulfillment of their sexual desires whenever and however they want within marriage, right? And as long as that's the case, then the sort of burdens and crosses we're going to ask single people to take up within the church are going to be just seem much heavier and much less reasonable. So these are the ways in which I set aside, maybe I'm wrong, but I want to ask this sort of question to help Christian communities think more deeply about the types of burdens we're placing on married and single people, and how married people can participate in those sorts of goods.
You keep bringing it back to single people and their calling, which I think, there's a lot of, a decent number of celibate gay people listening to this that are probably cheering you on like they've never cheered on a podcast guest before, to have a heterosexual married man be so concerned about the people committed to celibacy. You're winning some fans here. What do you do with 1 Corinthians 7? You know I'm going to go there, right? Obviously. Paul says, for the sake of prayer, yes, abstain, but don't deprive one another. And he doesn't even he's not even talking about procreation there. I think whenever a first century Jewish writer is talking about sex and marriage, procreation is just, I think it's in the air. It's assumed, right? Because so I don't think he needs to bring in procreation, but he does seem to be thinking about sex for pleasure there, which again, you're saying is a good of marital sex. It's not a bad. It's not an arbitrary add-on. You're shaking your head. What do you disagree with?
I just don't think that Paul is thinking about marital pleasure there at all. I think there's lots of the deprivation of one another is an obligation to give oneself to another as a gift. He never says that you can demand it. And is it 1 Corinthians 10, when he talks about money, he uses similar sort of authority language. He says, like, I could claim this, but I'm not going to. I want you to give, right? So the emphasis in 1 Corinthians 7 is on giving each other, like self-giving. But like, better to marry than burn, whatever that means. It's not clear to me that means sexual passion. It's also the case that it almost
certainly means sexual.
Okay, sure, fine. But the only time in that passage where the language of needs gets invoked or necessity gets invoked in 1 Corinthians 7, it very clearly has to do with procreation, right? The only time. So if you look at the evangelical marriage culture, sex culture, you have something like His Needs, Her Needs, right? Yeah. Massively best-selling book, just hugely popular, right? And what's one of his needs? Well, sexual activity, right? I think that is the most repugnant ideology. It's demonic. And the fact that I got 2 copies of that book as wedding gifts from people. I don't remember who gave me those wedding gifts, but like I genuinely think that ideology is fundamentally demonic. The only time when one needs
Mm.
to have sex is if one is trying to conceive. In which case, there is a discrete period of time in which you have to engage in intercourse. Otherwise, you are not going to conceive, right? That's the
Right.
only place where genuine necessity comes to bear.
So
The rest of it is you just like you don't get what you want. But not getting what you want, raising that to the level of I have a need here
mm,
is itself, again, the move on which like single people are going to flounder. We're asking single people to say, like, you don't get what you want and be okay with it, right? We're asking those who are trans to say, you don't get what you want. You want to
mm,
be, viewed as the other sex. Sorry, you don't. Those sorts of psychological wants, needs, I think they are important. I don't want to hear you say or hear me say that I'm minimizing them. They are important, but they are not needs
mhm.
in the way that I think First Corinthians 7 talks about needs. And don't even get me started on like the virgins
What?
that if the like the ESV's translation of First Corinthians 7 is abominable. It's just abominable. It's just a
Wait,
disaster.
which verse? Which verse are you talking about? The whole chapter or oh, they
Oh, the
cannot
whole
control
thing.
themselves. Oh. So I've yeah, I have a chapter on this in my book that came out, which you obviously haven't read. um,
I just got
which
owned.
I haven't read your book that I'm advertised either. So, um, yeah, to the this is verse 8. I think this is what you're talking about. To the unmarried and the widows, which if he says widows, like those are females, the unmarried are likely probably men whose wives have died as well. He's probably talking about people who were married, but there's been death to the spouse. It is good for them to stay unmarried as I do, but if they cannot control themselves, the translation should be, but if they are not controlling themselves. This is something Danny Treweck, who just wrote a great book on singleness, pointed
Yeah.
out that most likely what we're dealing with here are people who were once married. And I think according to Roman law, you had to get remarried within 2 to 3 years or something. Anybody who was widowed, it would be almost certain they would very quickly get remarried again. And people can fact check
Yeah.
me on that. I remember reading on the Roman law stuff. I don't do your own work there, but there was something like that. What Paul's talking about is two people who are basically betrothed. They're going to get married, but they're out having sex. And Paul says, if you are not controlling themselves, you obviously are not. You are engaging in sexual activity. Then you need to get married. Stop withholding marriage because you're gonna get married anyway. That's in the cards here. He's not talking about just any single person who has a really strong sex drive or something. Well, if you have a strong, might as well go get married. That's just not what's going on here.
But it's just not it's not obvious to me that what's at stake here is primarily a sex drive in that sense.
Yeah.
So in
No,
First
I
Timothy
agree.
5, right? In First Timothy 5, Paul enjoins the young widows to get remarried and have children.
Right.
But what he's worried about there seems to be an interest in luxury.
Mm.
And so you can imagine young widows who were left a lot of money by their husbands and who become worldly in a proper sense, where their attachments to wealth and to leisure, etc., drive them away from the faith very, very slowly. And that seems to be his concern there. It's very plausible that something similar is going on in the background here. But
Okay.
I will just say, like, I was thinking verse 25,
Oh.
when Paul starts talking about in the ESV, it's now concerning the betrothed.
Mm-hmm.
Like that translation is abominable. There's just no justification anywhere.
The ESV says to the now about the betrothed in verse 25. It doesn't say virgins.
It does not say virgins. The ESV says betrothed.
Why?
And what it does is it takes all of Paul's exhortations about what to do with these virgins and sexualizes them by making all of those instructions to young men who are seeking to do something with their virgins, who are burning with passion, etc. It's sexual, or with their betrothed rather, who are like, it sexualizes them when in fact they're virgins who are almost certainly under parental control, because that's what paternal control specifically, because that's how things were arranged. And so even within the ESV's reading of 1 Corinthians 7, it sexualizes 1 Corinthians 7 in just a way that I have no patience for.
Wow.
But this is, from my standpoint, how it reads this passage is indicative of the way in which we contemporary readers of the New Testament are inclined to sexualize all sorts of things that Paul does not sexualize, right? And 1 Timothy 5 is very similar, right? When Paul mentions the young widows and wants them to procreate, that really fascinating passage is like, get married, have babies, and become the lords of your house, right? Or the masters of your house, which, if you think about the gender dimensions of that, is just fascinating, because in the parables, you get the sort of masters of the house and they're all men, right?
Yeah.
And it's a sort of like paterfamilias type position, the head of the household. And Paul directs young widows to get married and then become the heads of their house. It's just a wild line. But within that, he's got this line about their passions. And we hear that as in this sexualized way. But Paul, I think, is very clearly, like, the Vulgate translates that line as luxury. And I think Paul definitely has in mind something like luxuria, this attachment to status, wealth, leisure, etc., which disappears from our conception of marriage and the reasoning behind it. But in fact, I will just say, if you move that sort of stuff to the foreground, what you get is a more practical, more applicable doctrine of marriage for young people today, for whom status considerations in marriage are often very close to the forefront, right? Like, it's not just what guy you find or what girl you find who you are attracted to. It's how much money is in their paycheck or, like, bank account. And so, like, status considerations, they're everywhere today. We haven't escaped it, but we don't think about it when reading some of these passages.
This episode is sponsored by Athletic Greens, now called AG1. Okay, so I try to eat as healthy as I can, except on pizza night and Taco Tuesday, but it's almost impossible to get all the nutrients that your body actually needs without taking some kind of nutritional supplement. And I've tried many supplements over the years, from like traditional vitamins to green powders, and I found AG1 to be the best nutritional supplement. It's packed with 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients, which just saturates you with the whole body nutrition that it needs. It supports your overall gut health, which is very important for your overall body health. It aids in digestion. It improves your immune system, your mood, energy, mental clarity, and it actually tastes good. Like, it's not too sweet, but has just enough flavor to make it go down, easy. Like, I actually look forward to drinking it. I've been taking AG1 now for over a year, and I could truly notice the difference. I have more sustained energy throughout the day. Like, I don't need that, third cup of coffee at 2 p.m. I don't need a nap anymore. I experience more mental clarity. I can live with the peace of mind that my body is getting all the nutrition that it needs, and I can truly notice the difference. So what I do is I typically take a serving first thing in the morning, right before my coffee. And if I'm feeling particularly run down or stressed out, or if I didn't sleep well, or if I'm traveling a lot and eating tons of junk that I shouldn't be eating, I'll sometimes take another serving in the afternoon, and I can honestly notice the difference in my health. So if you want to take ownership of your health, try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Go to drinkag1.com/TITR. That's drinkag1.com/TITR. Check it out.
Hey friends, it's Chris Sprinkle here. Preston and I are always looking for ways to come alongside and help empower vulnerable people. And that's why I'm so excited to tell you about Noonday Collection. I learned about Noonday Collection several months ago and have been so impressed by its heart and mission behind it. It partners with artisans in 15 different countries by creating dignified jobs and employment opportunities for people in vulnerable communities. And because of their fair wages and their dignified work, women are leaving prostitution and children are receiving an education and families are even staying together. Our friend Jessica Honegger, she started Noonday Collection over 13 years ago because she wanted to help empower women around the globe to find a way for sustainable living and freedom. She has gone around the world looking for unrecognized, talented artisans and created a business partnership with them. So if you're looking for high-quality jewelry, clothing, and accessories, and you care about empowering vulnerable women, come shop with Noonday Collection. All the products are high quality, handcrafted, and honestly, they are incredibly beautiful. If you're needing an accessory for yourself or you need a gift for a friend, consider purchasing it at Noonday. By doing so, you are making a difference in the world's most vulnerable communities. Go to chrissprinkle.noondaycollection.com. That is CHRIS sprinkle.noondaycollection.com.
Woo, lots to chew on here. So the going in 1 Timothy 5:14. So the NIV says, these young widows should marry, have children, and then it says to manage their homes. But the Greek word there is oikodespoten.
Yeah.
Despot, like that's what you're hinting at, right? It's not just managing your household, it's ruling over your right? That word oikodespoten is master of the house, right?
It's master of the house. It's a technical term. And it shows up so it's the verb form there, but in the Gospels, it shows up in a noun form. When it talks about, like in the parables, the master of the house getting ready for the return of the slave, right? And the master of the house goes running. There's all sorts of parables in Luke, I think it is Matthew, where that term shows up in a noun form. And like 1 Timothy is often criticized as a book of the Bible that's really bad for women, and I understand those types of anxieties, though I don't agree with them. But here's a moment in 1 Timothy where I think Paul is like very fascinatingly subverting certain norms and certain expectations around what women's roles should be.
1 Timothy 5 is fascinating. I mean, there's a lot going on there.
It's wild.
Are you egalitarian?
I don't know. No.
Okay.
No. No. I mean, in the sense that I'm not
looking for a confession or anything.
Well, it kind of feels like it.
Well, I was just curious, like what angle?
Well, no, I'm not. I don't think that women should be pastors, priests. I think I'm good with women in the diaconate, but I don't think the diaconate should be necessarily a pipeline to priesthood. I think, or the pastorate. I think it should be an independent vocation. I think women are called to it and should be supported in that sort of ministry. But I think there are limits there.
Okay, I didn't bring you on to. I was just curious because
those people who liked me before that you are mentioning they've just jumped off. Like,
there's a lot of
farewell.
I think my audience is gonna have a lot of whiplash whether they like you or not. Now, honestly, most people that listen to this podcast consistently, they like a good, honest, thought-provoking conversation. They're not trying to what side. And I get, I feel like if you look at my reviews, they're all either 5 stars or 1 star. And the 1 star is always like, you didn't fit my tribe, like you. Yeah. I mean, they're the most entertaining. I love reading the 1-star reviews. They're so entertaining. They're hilarious. So, but it does come down to either me or my guest didn't agree with them on something, but most people just want to engage a good, thoughtful conversation, which is what we're doing. So, but real quick, again, I'm going to keep tabs here. I don't think you answered my question about when I referenced 1 Corinthians 7, I meant the early part where it's like, do not deprive one another of sexual activity except for prayer, which I don't know if anybody ever does that. Honey, we're not gonna have sex for weeks. We're gonna pray a lot together. Anyway, that seems to be what Paul's talking about. But then he says, but don't like come back together. Like, what was the whole point of this? Wait, I brought up 1 Corinthians 7 in response to something you said earlier, and I forgot what it was now. That having sex. I
think you were going to say that I was right about everything and that we were going to move on.
Never. That sex within marriage isn't just for procreation is I think what I was responding to. It seems that Paul here says you do not deprive one another of sex, and he doesn't say so that you can make sure you keep procreating. Like, it seems to be sexual urges that he's talking about, because he does talk about like temptation, right? Like, sexual immorality is out there, but each one has, their own wife and husband and everything, and therefore don't deprive one another. Seems to be talking about satisfying sexual urges within marriage. At least that's how the passage is traditionally read. Do you disagree with that reading?
Not traditionally. I think that's a pretty contemporary reading of it. I'm looking up things that I've said on this. I did not come prepared to class. So no, I don't think that, well, for one, the agreement for a limited time, if you want to avoid children, guess what you have every month? Right. You have an opportunity every month to deprive yourself for a limited time in which you would turn your hearts and minds together as a couple directly towards God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I like.
What's your point? I don't understand.
My point is that there are ways of avoiding children and not and giving to each other that are built in to our bodies that we can honor without engaging in the preventative techniques of contracepting. And once you take the step of, so you can abide by all of this commandment, you can, and avoid children, and give to each other the full due, right? Paul doesn't say when we have a right to claim that due. And in fact, we don't have a right to claim that due. We have authority over the each other's bodies, but that authority is not one that, again, grounds a claim on the other that you can make that obligates them to give, right? The authority is only an authority to ask and receive, and that's it. And again, I'd point to, I think it's 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul uses the same language with respect to money. So I guess from my standpoint, a lot hangs on the fact that you can abide by this commandment in its fullness, by this form in its fullness, by honoring your flesh as God has created it without contracepting. And contraception comes with a lowered, like, it diminishes the formation of chastity for the couple, and it creates a contradiction in the will. In this way in which you're saying, I want sexual activity that is ordered towards children and would put us at risk of children, while saying no to children, saying no to the very biological realities that are built into this process. And that contradiction in the will, I think, is a deep moral problem.
How's a contradiction in the will if there are multiple goods within sex? I mean, and not every sex act needs to be aimed at accomplishing all three goods of sex. So we already said, pleasure, unitive, and procreation.
Yep. So it doesn't need to be aimed at all three, but it can't block one of the three. Right? It can't say no to one of the three while simultaneously saying yes to the other two.
I mean,
the three are integrated, and they're integrated for a reason, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, they come together for some type of reason. And the contradiction comes when we say, I want these two goods, but I'm saying no in this act to this other good.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. Yeah. What about, I mean, like you said, built in, well, okay. That's going to agree with your argument. I was going to say built into the very,
Oh, then
I was going to
say
say,
it.
well, I was going to say built into
Go
the
on.
very biology is times when you engage in sex, but procreation is not,
Absolutely.
is very, very, very unlikely. Like that is built sex during pregnancy, sex in old age, sex,
Yep.
at most times of the month when the woman is not ovulating. So
Honoring time. Honoring time is what we are called to do as
mhm,
creatures. God created us as beings who are in time, and he created time with a particular type of structure and
mhm,
form. It's not just an abstract, empty sort of void, right? If you look at the
mhm,
time of creation, there's 7 days, right? Like Ecclesiastes, there's a time for this, there's a time for that. Like honoring time is what we're called to as creatures. And all I'm saying is that at the very center of the union in male and female, there's a question about whether we are going to honor time and the
mhm,
times when we could conceive or not conceive, or whether we are going to, through technology, wrest that time into our own hands to control and possess the time and to claim goods for ourselves in seasons when God did not
mhm.
necessarily want us to have them, because that's not the seasons that God made us to live in at
Yeah.
that time. Right.
So
And
so
if you think like,
go ahead, go ahead.
yeah, no,
So you're
sorry. That's
saying,
I'm just soapboxing over here. I'm
so
soapboxing.
it's the deliberate block. So if somebody says, you know what, we are going to avoid all sexual activity when my wife is ovulating because we don't want to have kids, y- you would say that's actually okay. That would be
Yeah,
okay because you're
you're
not
gonna.
deliberately preventing. But
That's right.
you are, but you are. You're well. Are you? I mean,
You're
you're
choosing to
deliberately.
abstain.
You're choosing to, but you are on the positive. You are choosing to have sexual activity without wanting it to result in procreation. You're saying that would be within the bounds because
Absolutely.
you're honoring the biological rhythms that God has whatever wired into us, but it's a deliberate. It's contraceptive. I mean, this is the standard Catholic position, right? Why the official
Yeah, but
position,
it's.
though nobody
I think
abides
it's
by it.
said better than the Catholics.
It's how could it be better
No,
than? I mean, is what
well,
you're
no.
articulating the
In the
basic
sense
Catholic
that
position?
actually, I mean, my frustration is that, for what I swear, I've run this past a couple of Catholic bioethicists, and they've told me that they've not heard it put quite this way before,
Okay.
right? But I think like it's it's superior in the sense that honoring time is constitutive of our creatureliness. And if you do a theological anthropology and you think about what it means to be human and what it means to be human in time and what it means to honor not only biology in some abstract sense, where if I engage in this act, then there's a probability that the sperm will unite with the egg and we'll have an embryo, et cetera, et cetera. But if you think about sex as a participation in God's rhythm of creation and honor that, and you mediate your sex life through thinking about the disclosure of God's creation through
Mhm.
time, then all of a sudden you start to think like, oh, why is it the case that there is a time when we could engage in sex but not conceive of children? Well, the answer to that question is because God loves the unitive dimension of sex and wants us to enjoy that in the time when it's appropriate for us to enjoy that. And you think like, well, why is there a time when if we engage in unitive sex, we might have children? Well, because God loves children and loves the procreative end of sex and wants us to honor that. And if I have sex in the time when I cannot conceive of a child, I'm still honoring the
Mhm.
procreative end precisely by recognizing it as so valuable and so good that I'm not going to try to have the unitive end without it. I'm just going to honor God's decision to order my sexual life such by saying, here's the time in which I'm going to engage in the unitive dimension. Now, you have to have this sort of stance because there are certain people, while fertility based awareness methods have become much more accurate, right? Like the old jokes about natural family planning, meaning you're going to get another kid, they just don't apply anymore, right? Fertility-based awareness methods are much more successful at helping couples avoid conception if that's the vocation that God has put
that's
on
what I
them
was
at
gonna.
that point,
Is that
right?
that was my one not pushback, but just maybe note is, kind of the joke. What do you call two people who engage in family planning? Parents of 12 kids. Like you're saying that's not actually.
It's
Is there
it's
data?
it's not it's not the case anymore, right? Like the Pope Pius or Pope Paul VI Institute in Omaha, I think it is, like the Creighton model, it's like 99% successful at helping a couple avoid conception. Now, that 1% matters a lot, right? Like, I don't want to diminish that. And I've had friends who have engaged in this who have had a children out of that 1%, and it's been extremely difficult. So I don't want to minimize that in the slightest. But the idea that it's going to be like 70% successful or 80% successful, that's just not the case anymore. Right. So here's the other thing about here's one
contraceptive
last
isn't
point.
100% either.
Yeah, that's right. So one last point on this, right? Like these sorts of methods, what they require is mutual responsibility. Right. So if you think about many methods of avoiding or preventing conception, like the pill, whose responsibility is it? Well, the burden almost invariably falls disproportionately on the woman. Now, people are trying to change that. They're trying to develop contraceptives for males, and you have condoms, of course, right? But rarely is there sort of mutual responsibility and knowledge of the rhythms of a female's body, right? But if you engage in something like a fertility awareness based method, all of a sudden responsibility really does become mutual because both parties have to be aware of what time it is and what's possible within the marital union given what time it is and what they should be directing their attention and their energies towards. And so I think the whole framework is meant to order a marriage towards not satisfying their own desires whenever they want, but ordering a marriage towards God in the first instance and towards a life of fruitfulness and the fruitfulness of chastity in a really robust way. And I think actually, like, contracepting, it undermines all of that, takes it all away.
This is
not my most unpopular opinion. I just want to say.
Honestly, I don't yet totally agree, but that's a scholar is supposed to say that, right? I'm not quite convinced, but no, you've given us a lot to think about, and I think it's a theologically coherent argument for sure, biologically coherent as well. I don't know why it would be like why would people be upset? Because they can just disagree, say, you know what, Matt? Yeah, I don't like. But why would people be like upset at it? Like I don't know. It's like I know it's because they would feel like, what? So you think I'm in sin, or what you think or whatever? But I don't.
Yeah, there might be some of that. I mean, I do recognize the asymmetrical burdens here and the real dangers and hazards of pregnancy for women. And it sounds like what I'm saying is don't take that seriously.
Yeah.
Have babies whenever you want. And that's not what I'm saying. But and if I came across that way, I really don't intend to. So that's one of it. I mean, within theological circles, it's astonishing to me that contraception, I mean, you keep calling it the Catholic view, the no contraception standpoint, as though
it was a Christian view before 1960, right?
Yeah, that's right. Right. Like, it's astonishing to me that the pro-contraception position has been elevated to a mark of Protestant identity, as though to be a Protestant is somehow to have an affirming stance towards contraception. And I think people start worrying, like, oh, is that guy going to become Catholic? Is, like, what's he think about? But I say it's not this is why I say it's not my most unpopular view.
Well, okay, well, right. Since you threw me the carrot.
No, I don't. We shouldn't do this.
Oh no, you got time? I got a few more minutes. What's your most unpopular view?
Well, again, it's context specific. I mean, the in vitro stuff is really unpopular. Like objecting to in vitro, that makes me.
So you believe in vitro is no good?
Yeah. Yeah, don't do it. And I've written on that, so you can go see
Yeah.
that stuff at
Okay.
First Things and the Gospel Coalition. And
Okay.
so,
Is it
some
a
of my
form of
news.
abortion? Is that your argument, or what's the?
No, no. In
It's
fact,
not, right? Or-
my worry is that.
oh no, sorry. I was confusing it with something else. People are like abortion. What in the world? Oh, right.
Well,
Okay.
that is mostly, if evangelicals are opposed to in vitro fertilization, the death of embryos is about
Oh,
the
right.
beginning and
Okay.
end of their reasons to oppose it. And I think that doesn't go nearly far enough.
Mm.
I think if contraception is going to allow sex without babies, in vitro fertilization creates a world where we can have babies without sex. And
Mm.
I think that in the positive realm, making human life without sex is really wrong. And that brings with it a host of issues and their own questions. But I'm pretty in print on that. No, I actually have really like cranky thoughts about adoption
Okay.
that
Oh,
when
this
I've
is.
when I've said them in public rooms have generated a fair amount of ire
Mm. Are you not?
towards me.
You not pro adoption, or what's your? Do I dare push
Do
it?
you, do you dare? I don't know. Do you? Do you sure?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, I'm curious now. What's your views?
I mean, I think that in many cases, I think adoption is much more morally complicated than evangelicals have presented it. I think this is starting to change, but changing too slowly. I think there's lots of contexts where the first and primary priority of the church's witness on these things should be the establishment or the restoration and the support of the child's relationship with most likely his mother. And if that's not the case, then his father. And if that's also not the case, then with some biological parent or biological relative. And that adoption as a practice of the church needs to be ironically or paradoxically ordered towards supporting, maintaining, and helping those bonds, those biological bonds thrive. Here's a question that I will leave for people who are thinking about adoption. What does the couple who's seeking to adopt a child owe to the birth mother? What do they owe to the birth mother? And if it's the case that a birth mother is placing her child for adoption because, say, she doesn't have the financial resources to raise the child, why is it the case that it's right and appropriate to spend, I don't know, $40,000, which is what an adoption can cost in this country? Why is it right and appropriate to spend $40,000 to adopt a child rather than using that $40,000 to pay rent for that mother and child for, I don't know, it's a lot of years, right? $40,000 goes a long ways towards paying rent. Why is it not the case that a couple who's seeking to adopt is imagining adopting the mother and the child together as a part of their household? Why do we think about the family so much rather than the restoration or the expansion of the Christian household, which has marriage at the center of it, right? Some gay Christians are going to be mad at me for saying that, but I think unequivocally, Christian household has to have marriage at the center. I don't think the fictive family, I understand why people have gone in for that, but I think a Christian household needs to honor marriage. But within that, I think there's all sorts of ways in which other types of bonds can be folded into that sort of household. And the imagination within evangelical context around adoption is not very broad, right? There's actually a weird asymmetry between the pro-life movement and the adoption movement, and that the pro-life movement has invested a lot in trying to foreground the life of the mother, right? This is one of the things that's really shifted over the last decade, as we've talked about sort of two people who matter in adoption, in abortion, right? The embryo matters, but the mother matters. We've got to support the mother. When it comes to adoption, we have almost exclusively focused on what we owe the child and have not thought seriously or substantively about what we owe the birth moms in these cases. And I think if we did that, then there are lots of cases we might have to reconceive our adoption practices in domestically from the ground up.
Would you acknowledge? I mean, there's exceptions to that, right? I mean, what if it's like a very unsafe environment, household filled with drugs or whatever, and like it would be extremely unhealthy, if not unsafe, for the child to be raised there, and say the mother, and I think you would say, well, let's try to fix that, but let's just say you can't. Like there's not much to be done in that case. Would you're saying?
This is where I think like
I hear you saying that it's maybe there's several other steps that should be addressed before we just adopt. That's what I'm hearing you say, but not that there could be like a last or later resort where, okay, this is in a broken world, this is the best of the options is to adopt a child and not the parents.
Yeah, I think there are cases where adoption is right and appropriate. Okay. My impression is that those are actually much fewer than people would recognize, and that the adoption institutions are not ordered towards helping people escape their difficult situations or circumstances, but are ordered towards rescuing the children from those difficult circumstances, and are not ordered towards helping, let's just name it, mostly white, upper middle class families get involved in those mostly working class families' lives in such a way that the middle class families would be agents of helping the working class families improve their circumstances. Right now, there's all sorts of degrees of difficulty of that. I'm well aware of the types of hazards, and I don't think that you could at all romanticize these sorts of things. But I think if you ask the question, what do we owe to these, some of these people and some of these cases who might want to raise their child, but actually don't have an imagination where they could conceive of doing so because they feel so trapped by their unsafe living circumstances, by their desperate want of money, et cetera, right? Like, if those are the things that are keeping women from raising their children, then we should ask about why we're only trying to rescue the children from those circumstances.
You'll appreciate this. I was in Zambia. Gosh, when was this? Almost 10 years ago. Maybe even longer. Yeah, about 10, 11 years ago. I remember sitting down with a bunch of African pastors, and I asked the question. I go, it's that question I don't hear a lot of people ask. I said, how do you guys feel about American families adopting African kids and bringing them, over to America and raising them? And they said, oh, no problem. Like, yeah, we love, that they're helping out, and, we have a lot of needs and everything. And I said, well, what if that same family, instead of adopting a child, basically funded some biological family member to care for the child? Like if they would actually if they just gave the 40,000 or whatever to help, because typically it's for financial reasons, right? That the kid, in most cases, and they kind of looked at me like, am I allowed to answer honestly? It's kind of the look on their face, and they said, well, yeah, of course that'd be better, but who would ever do that?
That's right.
I didn't know. I just kind of sad. Even now I don't know. I mean, well, here's where my thinking is really shifted. Is and this is not even disputed among sociologists, that orphanages are not good. Like, that is, and I've had a couple of guests on that were in orphanage ministry for 10 years, and then the light came on. They're like, what are we doing? Like 90+% of orphans have at least one living parent. And the ones that don't have other family members, it's almost always because of financial hardship that they're not caring for the child. And orphanages, there's just all layers and layers and layers and layers of well-documented problems when a kid is raised in an orphanage, when there are other better solutions. There's a great organization called 1 Million Home that is it's aimed at basically taking kids out of orphanages and putting them in the families that they do exist. And I know a couple of friends that were heavily involved in orphanage ministries that tell me story after story of some of the abuse, the commercial, the fact that you can raise a lot of money for an orphanage, but it's hard to raise money for for the families that care for their kids, and it becomes this industry almost, And anyway, so that's my, well, I would say unpopular position, but it's only unpopular among like American Christians that haven't thought about it. I mean, you talk to any missionary on the field, and they're like, well, yeah, this has been well known among all the studies that have been done on this for decades. I mean, it's not. But so I guess my question is that's not totally unrelated to, because if it is adoption keeping orphanages going, is it part of? And I've had that question. I don't know the answer to that, honestly. But I think it's a question that we should wrestle with at least. But
it absolutely is. I mean, if like international adoption has so many difficulties, such that my line has more or less become the forms of adoption that I'm most comfortable with internationally are special needs children. Like in many countries, if a child has special needs, then they are just thrown to the curb. But the degree of difficulty of adopting a special needs child domestically or internationally, much less internationally, is just enormously high. And mostly people, I don't want to be too cynical, but in a lot of cases, people are seeking to adopt a child because they have an interest in, well, if you listen to adoption ministries who are trying to get people to adopt, they're looking for people who want to complete their family, so-called. And I think that sort of rationale is not a very good one when it comes to adoption. And the ways in which adoption ministries have targeted couples is, I get beat up a lot because I'm willing to say that there is still something like an idolatry of the family within context, and I get beat up because Gen Z, young millennial evangelicals aren't getting married at all. And I understand why it looks like we don't have an idolatry of the family, but I think we had an idolatry of the family and it let a generation down. They became very disappointed. And are we surprised that people are turning against the idols, that the next generation down would reject the idols of their parents? It doesn't surprise me. And I think that some of the ways in which our adoption institutions or culture has gone on are intertwined with all of this, right? Like we adoption out of foster care is its own set of questions, and I'm much more favorable towards it. I think like it's a much more.
I was going to bring that up. If you feel, if somebody's already in the foster care system, 100% it's better for them to be in a family. And we can talk about systemic issues all day long. It's like, well, we need to address the systemic issues that got the kid there in the first place. And amen. Meanwhile, this kid is in the foster care system, and
that's right. So, but if you look at the percentages of people who adopt out of the foster care system, it's pretty low, right?
Really?
Like the numbers of children in the foster care system haven't meaningfully gone down in the last 15 years since the evangelical adoption movement has exploded. At least that's my understanding. So, which is a problem. But this is where I'm not trying to make myself unpopular. I'm really not. And I'm really open to being wrong on this. These are the sorts of questions that I really want people to ask so that we can see the extent to which we as a community are implicated in the kinds of ideologies, in the kinds of deeply morally problematic frameworks that we are denouncing on a regular basis when they appear in non-evangelical contexts. Right? Like it's very easy to scapegoat the other side. And I understand, I think progressives, seculars, et cetera, are doing lots of things that are really bad. It's very easy to do that and very tempting to do that without having internal integrity and discipline and maintaining norms within our own communities that are extremely painful to us to maintain, because we haven't maintained them for 20, 30 years. And I think until we recognize the full scope of our own complicity in some of this stuff, we just won't be able to talk to a culture in such a way that it sounds like what we have to say to them is good news, right? Because we've acknowledged our own complicity in this. And so we can say, we too are culpable. Here's some mercy, right? But the line that has shaped my thinking more than any other line, I think, over the last decade is from Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, right? We do pray for mercy, and those same prayers teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. Like it's if you start there by examining your own community, our own complicity as individuals and people, what you realize is we do pray for mercy. And that teaches us to render deeds of mercy to those who are outside of our communities, who might be carrying disproportionate burdens or might be engaging in grave moral wrongs because they have a bad story about who we are as a community. And that's not a recipe for a tribe.
Yeah. Dude, that's a good place to end. And thank you for being honest. I mean, it just doesn't, I'm just not wired. I don't get it. But it's one thing to have a viewpoint that people disagree with. Maybe they even find it offensive, but to be like upset because you have asked hard questions, that's just shouldn't be. So hopefully not too many people are upset, even if they don't agree with the word that you said in the last hour and 15 minutes. Yeah. But again, we should all agree at the very least, you've given us you've raised some really, really hard questions that have a lot of thought behind it. So yeah.
That's what I'm trying to do.
The burden is on us to wrestle with it. And if we disagree, I have good reasons to disagree. So Matthew, I got to run, but great talking to you. I got to have you back on. Maybe hopefully it won't be another 8 years before I have you on.
That's right. We should do it like every 4 years or something.
We didn't get your book, but the book is, again, called Into Questions, Cultivating the Love of Learning Within the Life of Faith. I mean, I'm going to assume that the nature of this book is similar to the nature of how you've even gone about this whole conversation, asking hard questions, being okay with that. Is that right or no? Did I miss it?
Yeah, that's right. It's a theological ethics of questioning. I want people not just to ask questions, but to really question well, and to question in conformity with the gospel, and to understand that certain questions are dangerous to ask and difficult to ask, and maybe certain questions we shouldn't ask, and to wrestle with that in terms of questions. So that's the sales pitch. Cool. Available everywhere, October 3rd.
Books are sold. Awesome. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate you, man. Take care.
Yeah, thank you.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.